Volya Radio. Slava Ukraini!
Well, welcome, Mr. Giles. We're looking forward to the discussion with you. Anyways, it's going well this morning. I finished the book recently. Very good. It's exciting to be here to talk about what such an important book at a key time for us. And I see Kiers is joining us as speaker. Welcome, sir. And a good evening to you, and a good morning out from my part of the world where it's still a little bit dark. So morning will come eventually to me, but it is early. So for me, anyway. Well, Kier, this is an exciting opportunity. Your book, "Who Will Defend Europe," is a pretty stark case, and it follows several other books that you've written, and so the consistency of the theme is a little bit alarming. So I think there's good news in all of it, but we'll have to talk about that with John. Um, where shall we begin? I think we have to talk about who Keir is, or let him do that, John.
I think that's probably a good place to start. Keir Giles is a senior consulting fellow at the Chatham House. Military policy think tank or security think tank. I also, according to your Wikipedia page, and Wikipedia is always right, I'm told, that you were at one time an actor and a stand-up comic as well. So you've certainly done some interesting things along the way. It's an excellent book. I'd like to talk more about that in a moment. But if you'd perhaps just like to introduce yourself, and if there's anything you'd like to say at this point, please go ahead, Kit.
Sure, thank you. Just as soon as I finished frantically checking my Wikipedia page to see what it says these days, it looks like it looks like it's fairly stable and fairly accurate because it goes through spates of vandalism at odd moments for obvious reasons. Yes, I have quite a few official job titles. That Senior Consulting Fellow of Russia and Eurasia Program at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, is just one of them. But none of them really mean a great deal to normal people. So whenever I get the option, I just describe myself as a professional explainer of Russia, which I've been for about the last 2 to 3 decades. First of all with BBC, particularly BBC Monitoring, then transitioning to the UK Ministry of Defence and their Conflict Studies Research Centre, which used to be the in-house red team trying to explain Russia and what it was up to. And then for the last 15 years in the private sector, because we were no longer required by the Ministry of Defence. So we just carried on explaining Russia, just sending people a bill at the end. And so that's the reason why I've written the books that you refer to, which you're right, there is a theme that runs through all of them. And I'm glad that you said there was good news in there, because I generally, when I put good news in, it turns out to be the only part of the book that's actually wrong. Because the very first one that I wrote had an optimistic bit towards the end, because the publishers at the time said that it was all too grim, too gloomy, too depressing, and there had to be some good news. So could I please find something that was optimistic to put in? And the result of that, of course, is that it's the one part of that book, Moscow Rules, that is completely wide of the mark. It was about how the younger generation might eventually find that they're able to have some influence on politics within Russia because they didn't have that experience of being repressed, and because they were able to self-organize across the internet, which, of course, with the pattern of increasing repression that we saw in Russia from mid-2021 onwards, that hope disappeared very rapidly. So I try not to put anything unduly optimistic in the books. But this last one, Who Will Defend Europe, that's one where I hope I break the track record of generally being right about what it's predicting, because each of the books so far has taken the stance that here is a problem with Russia, here is something that is going to get very much worse and more dangerous if it is not addressed promptly. And then, of course, time goes by, it is not addressed promptly, and the problem gets more worse and more dangerous. And now here we are in 2024. So who will defend Europe is about where we may end up if nothing is done to actually deter Russia from its next act of aggression. And this is the reason why I very much hope that on this occasion, I'm actually going to be completely wrong, wildly wrong, and nothing bad is going to happen. Because if it does, the consequences for all of us are going to be very dramatic indeed. Sadly, of course, I did let a little bit of optimism creep into to that book, where at the time I finished the draft, the new government, the new Labour government in the UK had just come in and was making all the right noises about deterrence of Russia, about investment of defence. The new Defence Secretary, John Healey, was actually being quite positive about how to fix the British armed forces and Britain's defence capacity. Since then, of course, that has turned out to be wildly wrong too. That's run into the quicksand with claims of financial black holes that the Labour Party has to fill, and them focusing on targeting class enemies instead of defending the country, and a strategic defence review, now the fourth one in 5 years, which has kicked the problem down the road for a year. So once again, I fell into the trap of putting something into one of these books that was mildly optimistic, and that turned out to be the bit of the book that was incorrect.
That kind of reckless optimism, I think, probably best avoided in future publications.
Yes.
I read Russia's War on Everybody. I think it was over the summer, and I was kind of, there's all the sort of the low level stuff that gets reported in the news, but the way he joined all of that together into this kind of coherent strategy for me was extremely eye opening and very worrying. This latest book, it has a tremendous clarity. It's tremendously objective assessment of what situation we find ourselves in, and it's extremely well evidenced. And you've obviously got a lot of high-level contacts who are kind of giving you information in the background as well. Also enjoyed the kind of the dry humour that you have in it. And I had this feeling that every single word of it kind of counts. It's just such a tremendously compelling book and an extremely worrying book all at the same time. So I'm really kind of looking forward to getting into more of the details on that as we go through. But is there anything you'd like to add, James, before I kind of move on to the next part of the plan that we have for this interview?
I think only that your book is so up to date. It almost feels like it's reading the future. And so I really applaud that. And so I'm looking forward to getting into the details. And I just want to say the bright spot, probably Finland, from what I hear in the book.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the kind words about both of the books. That's very heartening to hear. I mean, first of all, with Russia's War on Everybody, yes, it was a case of joining the dots between all of these different things that had been observed, and not just by me, happening across Europe, but in a way in which it seemed nobody had really put the pieces together. And it seemed, sadly, European governments were not really putting the pieces together, discerning the overall pattern and thinking about what it actually meant, which is alarming, because these are the people that are supposed to be keeping us safe against this kind of campaign. So yes, it's that described a position in the middle of 2022. Since then, of course, the position has evolved, but as with so much else, it's got dramatically worse just in the last few months. Now we have far more reckless and dangerous and irresponsible actions by the Russian foreign intelligence services, even than were described in that book, with the Russian military officers kind of forming murder gangs through cruising across Europe, choosing their victims. Now you have this reporting of the targeting of aircraft using incendiary bombs in DHL packages dispatched from Vilnius, which so far, fortunately, touch wood, have not actually caused a tragedy, but apparently more by bad luck for the Russians than any kind of vigilance on our side. So things are getting worse, and we're now at the stage that I wondered about in Russia's war on everybody, where I was suggesting that one thing that was missing from the campaigns that we were seeing from Russia was the old Russian habit of sponsoring or facilitating organized terror groups to carry out mass casualty events against European capitals. And I think now we can finally say that we are back at that stage. We are back at the stage where they do appear to be undertaking sabotage missions which do risk mass casualties, and people ought to be more aware of that. As for who will defend Europe being about the future, well, yes, it is very specifically about the future. And the risk, of course, with a book like that being so contemporary is how much is actually going to change between the time when you put the finishing touches to the draft and it goes into the publishers, which in this case was mid-July, and when it actually appears in public, which in this case was the end of October. And with the pace things are moving at now, an awful lot of things could have changed during that period. Some did. Some for the worse, particularly in the UK, as I mentioned a few moments ago. Other things, we've stayed on that general trend line of careering towards disaster at an accelerating pace. So in that respect, things are changing fast, but there's no change in where we're actually going to end up unless something changes. And speaking specifically about the future, yes, the point of disagreement that I drew out there from all of the different European defense and intelligence services and governments that have actually expressed an opinion on when Russia will mount its next attack against a NATO target. The agreement is it's going to happen. The disagreement is how soon it's going to happen. And you now hear these figures quoted between 3 and 5 years, which is an extremely short time when you are looking at European defense capacity reconstitution being measured in closer to a decade. As for the point about Finland, yes, the answer to that question in the title of the book, Who Will Defend Europe, is unless anything changes, it is Poland and Finland that we look to for the role models of what needs to be done. Poland, because it is investing so heavily in its own defense capacity in order to deter Russia or withstand Russia if deterrence fails. And Finland, with a defense capacity of its own that's not to be sniffed at, also setting the pace for how to look after your civilians, your society, your country, your economy, when it is under attack. And that, of course, is a crucial element to withstanding Russian aggression as well, as we see demonstrated so clearly in Ukraine. In some respects, what happens in the front line is not necessarily what's going to decide the war, because if you are pummeling energy infrastructure, pummeling cities, making sure that the economy cannot function, then a country is not in a fit position to withstand aggression because it can no longer function as a state. And that is what Finland and those other countries, particularly the Nordics and Baltics, that are looking to that model of total and comprehensive defense, try to ensure is going to happen by making sure that the functions critical to the continuing of society are actually protected and civilians are protected as well. And there too, you have this astonishing contrast between the frontline states that take the threat seriously and are taking steps to protect themselves and to make sure that they can withstand an attack, and countries further to the west, like, for example, the UK, which has no visible civil defense system at all. So if the country is under attack by any means, essentially, civilians are on their own.
It's a terrifying prospect to not have an army that you ostensibly would expect is going to be there for anything that happens, and then you find out they're not there, and if they are there, they're underfunded, and perhaps critical weapon systems have, in fact, been done away with, as you point out about Germany and some of the air defense issues there. And have you determined in your mind a root cause for this sort of avoidance of reality?
There are plenty of root causes, some of which we have identified a long time ago in terms of being not willing to confront the reality of an aggressive Russia, because it messes with your plans for doing business with Russia, and it messes with your nice, neat, tidy idea of international relations and how Europe works together. And, of course, the new ones, which is that it is extremely inconvenient for governments to have to think about funding defense when they have not done so for 2 or 3 decades. And of course, and this is something that I detail quite a lot in the book, the way in which economies have changed over that period means that it is even more challenging now to actually make the kind of investment in defense, even that we had in the late Cold War, let alone during a period of active conflict or preparing for it, like the late 1930s that we hear compared with so often. So again, taking the example of the UK, and I mention the UK a lot now because it is the one where it's the exception that proves the rule. It is where a new government has come in with paying lip service to recognition of the challenge, but actually apparently ignoring it altogether because it is just too hard to deal with. So you have a government budget which is going to be declared in a couple of days in the UK. There is very little discussion of any uplift for defence, let alone the kind of transformative uplift for defence that would not only put right the deficiencies that are well known to everybody in the armed forces, but actually put them in a state that's fit for conflict. Instead, all of the arguments are about the way in which a new socialist government is going to basically take out a vindictive policy against anybody they see as class enemies, not realizing that actually the real challenge to them is coming from somewhere else altogether. Meanwhile, you have the chiefs of the services and the chiefs of the defense staff once again saying that we have an armed force that is not actually ready for conflict. This is a message it's not new, but it has been growing steadily stronger over the last year to 18 months, but without apparently triggering the kind of action that you might expect if that's recognized as a problem by central government.
Thank you. Well, I am particularly concerned about Germany because of the leadership there. Is it a matter of new leadership? Do you think that can change things? It seems like it's a little bit slow paced if they're trying to wait for leadership. So it seems like much more immediate action is needed, and it also seems to be a complete misread of Germany's own history, and maybe that's part of the problem. I've always wondered about Germany's special role as a villain in World War II, and now we're expecting them to be a hero. And I don't know that that's a major thing or not, but it has always puzzled me why they can't understand from their own history that they need to have a defense of what is now a better country.
Well, I should stress I'm not a Germany watcher, so when those people that are Germany watchers explain in intricate terms the party politics that leads to constraints on policy options, I find it just baffling. But also, of course, some of the public expressions, the end results of these German political psychoses that we hear described to us in such painful terms backs up your thesis absolutely. A failure to recognize just what exactly the implications of Germany's role during the Second World War really are. This is a country which is refusing to protect Ukraine to the fullest extent possible because of its role in invading Ukraine in 1941. And that's one of the underlying fallacies, one of the underlying strange ideas driving German politics that leads to so many counterintuitive approaches to Russia, not only the way in which Russia is seen, the way in which the suspension of disbelief, the suspension of reality when dealing with Russia has been the driving characteristic of Germany's approach to dealing with not only the current conflict, but also the lead up to it as well. So yes, you can look around Europe and you can find different countries which in different ways embody this challenge, and each in their own way form a particular weak link in the chain that has to pull together in order to defend Europe. Each country has its own particular national problems and national difficulties in terms of recognizing the threat, but the general pattern is the same as it's always been. It's a gradient of threat perception and as a result of willingness to address the problem, running from east to west, where the frontline states recognize just how serious the challenge is and what's going to be done if they don't meet it, whereas those further away think that they are insulated by distance and so can hope and pretend that it's actually going to be somebody else's problem. Sadly, they are going to be very, 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 very wrong.
Thank you for that. yeah, I don't think I would pretend to be an expert on Germany either, but like James, I do find it all very puzzling. I think to get back to kind of the general sort of thesis of your book, that Europe is basically extremely underprepared and that it needs to prepare very quick, and also that there is something coming down the track pretty quickly which might influence how Europe will need to respond in the form of the American presidential election next week, I think it is. But before we get to that, I'd just like to come back to one thing, just bring us right back to now, where we are. And I'm sure you've seen that there have been several elections recently, such as in Moldova, also the referendum there. Also Georgia, I think on Saturday. I believe Bulgaria has elections tomorrow, but that's kind of going pretty much under the radar, I think. And I'm kind of very much struck by the kind of the blatant and brazen tactics that Russia has been using to influence these elections. And I'm wondering, like, how far those tactics are what they've always done, and how far they're kind of feeling emboldened to kind of carry out this kind of sort of overt influence on democratic process in various countries around Europe now. So what I'm trying to get at, I think, is that you outline so much of this sort of stuff in that book, Russia's War on Everybody. And do you feel like that they're kind of stepping up their game here in terms of this electoral interference, or do you think this is just kind of standard par for the course stuff?
Well, in one way, it's standard par for the course, because the tactics that we see evolve to the extent that the technology available evolves, but the underlying principles of how things are done remain precisely the same. But the reason for that, of course, is because it works. If these tactics get decent results, then why would Russia actually want to change them at all? And in terms of becoming more brazen, doing the same thing but more overtly, well, that too is a general pattern that we've seen again since Russia's change of strategic gear in the middle of 2021, when they decided that actually now was the time to push for what they wanted without any restraint, without any attempts to maintain a relationship with the West. And part of that has been the abandoning of pretense. There is no reason for Russia not to be completely overt and blatant about what it's doing if there's no downside. What exactly are the costs and consequences to Moscow going to be for doing something overtly that everybody knows they were doing covertly beforehand? And the answer is apparently not very much, because let's consider what is happening in Georgia at the moment. Is Russia going to suffer from this program of state capture through traitors? Probably not. It is probably going to be, sadly, yet another geostrategic win for Russia by using the tactics to which, it seems, nobody in the West has found a counter.
Sadly, I think that was my own kind of appraisal of the situation. There's been, I think there was a statement from Anthony Blinken earlier today, which was a bit kind of weak and concerns and oh no, this is not very good at all. But there's really nothing to back it up, and I do wonder exactly what can be done, and I find it all very worrying. James, any thoughts on this?
Well, first, there have been some sanctions that have been placed on certain individuals in Georgia, and I do not know, but I have heard that these have some effective components to them, and perhaps it's time for more sanctions from the United States in that regard. At least that's something that is a positive action that is being done. And sanctions do eventually hurt the nations, and I'm not sure that we want to hurt Georgia, but as they become increasingly Russified, then we have to consider that maybe that is the right option. So I think that's a very difficult choice to make, whether or not to punish who is ostensibly a friend, right? Should we punish them or should we not? It's a difficult choice.
I think the other problem to bear in mind is, of course, that that's Georgia, which might seem like a fairly far away problem, but exactly the same challenge faces the United States. So who's going to impose sanctions on whom if Russia also succeeds in state capture through elected politicians in the US in just over a week from now? That is, of course, the biggest prize, the greatest glittering prize for Russia. And there's no doubt they'll put in a great deal more effort there than we've seen in any of these other elections to date, because it's all to play for.
Perhaps moving on to that, James, I think it's chapter 3 in your book. You set out a very kind of clear an objective review, I think, of all the sort of protagonists in the current election race. There seems to be a lot of blame to go around. And though we may have perhaps reservations about what a President Harris might do, I think most of us here will agree that Trump is an absolute disaster waiting to happen. And you kind of brought a lot of information into that chapter there about the kind of things that Trump has been saying, the kind of things that he appears to be planning to do. And I wonder if you could perhaps set those out for our audience here, who may have heard them sort of piecemeal here and there, and just give us kind of a summary of how you see a Trump presidency panning out, first for Ukraine and then for Europe more generally, in terms of its response to Russia.
Yes, that's quite a challenge because there's just so damn much of it. The way in which Trump has, at every possible opportunity, favored Russia's preferred policy outcomes for the United States over U.S. national security is something which is curiously absent from a lot of the debate that we see from outside the United States coming up to this election. And it seems to be a symptom of the collective amnesia of what actually went on during the previous Trump presidency. I've had very intelligent, knowledgeable people tell me that they think that Trump was, quote, tough on Russia, unquote. People who are saying this apparently absolutely sincerely, believing this to be the case. And yet, if you look at every single example that people bring forward to back up this idea that Trump is not, in fact, favoring Russia over the United States, it invariably turns out that this is something which he either did not know about, could not prevent, or was furious about when he actually discovered that it was happening. And every actual policy initiative that was brought about by Trump himself, even from statements right from his inauguration, before his inauguration, it's all Russia friendly. It all favors the outcomes that Russia would like to see for the United States. Now, in some cases, that is not immediately obvious to people who are not intimately familiar with what Russia has been trying to achieve over the last 50 years. And I repeat, 50 years, not just since the end of the Cold War, but well before that. It takes a Russia watcher. It takes somebody that understands Russia's foreign policy objectives to see just how closely Trump's actions and his words and his apparently unrelated initiatives actually match what it is that Russia wants to see the United States do and what it is that Russia wants from the United States. In terms of a specific question, what has he promised? Well, the Ukraine first, you said, yes, bringing an end to the Ukraine conflict within a day. I would be fascinated to see how that would happen, other than through some means of coercing Ukraine into meeting the objectives that Putin has laid out and Trump and Vance have endorsed. Because let's not forget, there is no gap between what Putin is asking for and what Trump and Vance are suggesting for the outcome of the conflict. For the rest of us, the question that we have to remember is that there may have been legislation passed to try to Trump-proof the United States' NATO membership, saying that a president cannot unilaterally withdraw from NATO. But that doesn't really matter because the nature of NATO is such that you don't have to pull out of the alliance to neutralize it altogether. You don't have to do anything actually overt to even criticize NATO to make sure that it doesn't function as intended, because the United States as the core, as the backbone of NATO's military strength, if it has a commander-in-chief that does not give the word to its forces to meet their NATO treaty obligations, or that puts a stop order on movements when they are ready to go, that is the most potent means that Russia can achieve of actually ensuring that it blocks the area of conflict from reinforcements arriving from the United States. Back in 2018, 2019, 2020, the fashion of the day was A2AD, anti-access and area denial. It was mostly talking about Russian and Chinese missiles that would prevent aircraft, ships, land transport from moving towards or into an area that they wanted to actually protect and deny it, keep the United States out. And the point that we were trying to make at that stage was that the most effective way of doing that is nothing to do with bombs or missiles. It's actually causing the democratically elected leader of a country to not meet its obligations, to not give the order to move, or interfering in the chain of command so that order to move is not passed on. And sadly, we've already seen an example of this happening, not under Trump, but actually under the Biden administration, as part of the constraint, as part of the unwillingness to do anything which inconveniences Russia. At the very start of the full-scale invasion, in fact, shortly before it, February 2022, US EUCOM, European Command, was obviously inclined to make its dispositions to move to a more defensive posture, to be ready if the situation deteriorated out of hand unexpectedly, but then received a political order from the White House to stop, to stand still, not to do anything, not to prepare for worst-case scenarios. And after all of the years that EUCOM had worked hard on military mobility, worked hard on being sure that it was able to actually move across Europe in a timely fashion when it was needed, to overcome all of the bureaucratic obstacles to moving troops across borders, moving ammunition, etc., making sure that railway maps were up to date, they could confidently put stuff on a train or on a load of hets and get them to where they were going. The one thing they hadn't anticipated was a political bloc from their own side that was preventing them doing that. And that leads us on to the point that we'll probably talk a little bit about shortly, which is that, yes, as you mentioned, we have a choice now between a bad situation under the current administration and a disastrous one under Trump. But in fact, the current administration that's a situation which is getting worse, not better, because of all of the different pressures that are now piling up on the United States. In addition to its pathological reluctance to offend Russia, you have everything going on around the world, which makes the job even harder for whoever is allocating resources and attention between the global theaters that the United States has to cover. So if Trump is not elected, that really is not the end of our problems, not only because of the amount of difficulty that it could cause out of office, as was demonstrated so painfully during the block on US aid to Ukraine by Congress earlier on, but also if he chooses to oppose the election result and the amount of chaos that can cause. But even if the election goes smoothly, and even if Trump does not cause trouble thereafter, you still have a US problem in that the avoidance of escalation has now been augmented by the fact that there are, as a result of avoidance of escalation, so many different conflicts around the world which the United States has to give its attention to. And very clearly and demonstrably, at least one of those, i.e. targeting Israel, is of far greater importance to DC than Europe.
I'm afraid you are correct, and I'm a little bit worried that the response that Israel had, which was an effective blow to Iran, didn't culminate with something that was a little bit more conclusive. It will set Iran back, but these are all things that, given time and the space to do it, they can recover from. But I think that we should maybe take one or two of the questions. Pickled, I know you had a question earlier. I don't know if you are unable to speak now, but I think you were next in line. I'd love to hear what you have to say. So please go ahead, Pickled.
Oh, thank you, James. I really appreciated the space. Thank you, John, as well. And this is incredible listening to Keir. I'm really looking forward to reading this book. I did have a question, but you guys basically already answered this. We talked about NATO, Europe, all the different threats that are emerging, right? And my question came when Keir, you mentioned, Germany, but I think there's also another really interesting further how Russia was able to infiltrate and basically neutralize a military and political alliance through Hungary, right? And I think you really touched bases on all of those elements as well. So I really appreciate this. So not really a question because I already got the answer, but thank you. I will continue to listen.
Thank you.
Well, I do think it's an important point anyway, because the other thing we need to remember is we've been focusing so much on military threats and the military preparedness of Europe, which is probably the greater part of what my book is about. But we shouldn't they shouldn't allow that to lead us to overlook the fact that Russia has so many other different ways of getting its way that don't, in fact, involve rolling tanks over borders. And we see that playing out now in Georgia. We see it playing out to some extent in Hungary, Slovakia, again, to a slightly more limited extent. And it's just an illustration of the fact that conflict now has such a broad meaning, and we should not necessarily assume that tanks massing on the border is a sign of an imminent move towards state capture. There is so much else against which societies need to be vigilant, and against which in particular a lot of Western governments need to be more vigilant than they apparently are at the moment.
Thank you for that. Yeah, well, we're seeing really broad spectrum war here, whether you want to call it Gerasimov's, whatever, or hybrid warfare. It is really across the board. So that's an important point. Well, we've got more hands, so let's go to the. I have trouble pronouncing your name, but you with the yellow background and the red and blue.
You can call me Thomas. Yeah, you can call me Thomas. I had an initial point, and then listening since I raised my hand, got a few more points. But my initial points was regarding seeing the Western countries that are further west of the role model, Poland and Finland, where they don't see the imminent threat. They regard the defense budget might be a problem. From there on, the whole discussion about this is defensive, and what about turning it into not offensive, but more like what does Europe want to achieve? Because in the fall of the Soviet Union and the EU started to include Poland and all those eastern countries, including Finland, Sweden, there was a lot of European visions about what Europe wants to become a strong union where we could use the um, the union would become more like a energy house, like the United States, a powerhouse in the world. And there were a lot of visions. And then there was this long period where we obviously went astray from that path by pure bad actions, where Germany, for example, and Angela Merkel started to include Russia in this buildup of this powerhouse, which was a big mistake, which manifested by the Nord Stream.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but let's deal with the question here. You're making sort of a long commentary, and I do want to respect our special guests here and his time. So I think the question that I heard from that is, what do you think it is that is the goal of Europe? And does that help us better understand things?
Yes. What can we use? Can we extend from looking at the pure defensive side to more offensive or more visionary side? Because then the defense problem of defense and the cost will only be a matter of well, it's necessary.
Okay.
Because we can't achieve anything without.
Okay, listen. Let's let Keir respond to this.
You might need to unmute your mic, Keir.
Yes, apologies, everybody. My connection here seems to be a little bit flaky whenever I do this, so it's fell over in the middle there. But thanks for summarizing the question at the end. And I think coming back to the very beginning of Thomas's observations, the problem that we have is not that it is not understood that there is a threat. It is that that understanding has not led to action. There is a disconnect between the avowal, the recognition, the admitting that we are in serious danger, between anything actually being done that's commensurate to that threat. And you see this across a range of those different Western European countries that you mentioned. Germany, of course, being the prime example, where the Zeitenwende said all the right things, but then very quickly ran into the quicksand. The UK, where the problem has been punted down the track. France, where you have had Emmanuel Macron, who has performed the biggest volte-face in any European state, from suddenly flipping from this from somebody that wanted to see a partnership with Russia to recognizing Russia as the main threat to European security. And yet, the French defense budget, for all of the increases that it's seen over the last couple of years, is still tinkering around the edges. It's still incremental increases rather than that transformative increase that we see as necessary to recognize the fact that this is a major war in the offing, and that needs to be invested in accordingly. So it is a failure of imagination across so many different Western states that we're observing, and a failure to recognize that the risk of tinkering with the state budget, the risk of changing priorities in your government budgeting, is actually less than the risk of existential defeat and blighting the future of your people for generations to come. That recognition somehow has not actually led to a significant change in government prioritization and approaches anywhere except in the frontline states, and even in those, some are having difficulty. You might recall in Estonia, there have been these long wrangles over how much extra tax people can actually pay in order to ensure that the country is ready to withstand what is coming down the track from Russia. And there was the suggestion put forward that actually, to make it plain what this is all paying for, you should refer to these extra payments as a Putin tax, because it is precisely his fault that people are having to dig deep in their pockets to protect the country. And I think that is an excellent suggestion, which really should be replicated further across Western Europe. But coming back to the meat of your question then, about the other elements of preparedness and making sure that you are actually able to deal with the situation that we're all going to be in a very short space of time from now, it's at one further remove from where governments mentally are at the moment, if they think that they are far enough away from Russia that it's not going to affect them. And the kind of caricature, the parody, which proves this point about the distance from Russia being the determinant of how seriously you take the problem. Look at, for example, Ireland, which has effectively outsourced significant sectors of its defence to the UK because it thinks that neutrality is a protection, and is now suddenly faced with the fact that not having had, for instance, maritime patrol aircraft, any subsea capability, but having a large area of maritime space to defend, they are looking to how exactly they can put that situation right, and it's causing some extremely anguished soul-searching in Ireland. So the pattern holds good. The closer you are to the issue and the stronger your folk memory of having been dominated by Russia in the past, the more likely you are to actually be serious about trying to prevent it happening again in the future.
Thank you for that. Let's go right on to David Bailey. David, you put your hand down, but I know you were next. And if you're available, please do speak up, and welcome.
Thanks very much to Heike. Thanks very much for taking the time to join us. I'm distracted with something else, so I have to come back later. Sorry, James. Please move on to the next question.
Understood. Thank you. Well, I believe, William, you are next, and good to see you, sir. And what's your question or comment?
Hello, and thanks for hosting this space. I didn't get to read the entire book yet. I just got it yesterday. But asking a question, Britain in general has been a good defender of Estonia during the War of Independence. They helped with a lot of machine guns and keeping the Baltic clear of the Russians and helping them win that war. And they are the ones that are supposed to be defending Estonia. They just signed an agreement saying that the 4th Brigade would be there to defend Estonia if there ever was an attack. How realistic is Britain Army and the 4th Brigade willing to defend Estonia and help out if that ever does happen, Russia's invasion?
Oh, that's excuse me. That's very realistic, and that is precisely what they are there for, and that is precisely what will happen. And yes, it's correct that it was serendipitous in some ways that the UK ended up as the framework nation for NATO's enhanced forward presence in Estonia for not just the historical reasons. And yes, excuse me, the UK, particularly the Royal Navy, did play a significant part in Estonia's War of Independence in 1919, so much so that most Estonian Navy warships now are not only former Royal Navy mine clearance vessels, but they're actually still named after Royal Navy admirals. Such was the significance of the role in that achievement of independence. So yes, there were the historical ties, but also the one thing that Estonia particularly wanted as part of this NATO program to ensure that NATO was involved in anything that happened there right from the very start was, they said, a nuclear power on board, because that they saw as the safeguard against Russian nuclear blackmail. And let's not forget, this is going back a decade, and it's just another reminder that nuclear blackmail from Russia didn't start in February 2022. It's actually been a constant for far longer than that. And in that respect, of course, they hit the jackpot as part of their first contingent. It was the UK and France, the two countries in NATO with a so-called independent nuclear deterrent. So they got exactly what they wanted. But more broadly, simply the fact that these NATO EFB contingents were present already in the countries they were supposed to defend, at a stroke removed so many of the scenarios that had been put forward for how Russia might seek to undermine NATO by attacking one of those countries. They disappeared completely from conversations about Russia's options. The alarming thing, of course, is now that they are back, partly because of Russia's clear determination to attack regardless of the costs, but also, and to an even greater extent, they are back because of this hesitancy from the United States, and because of the concern that all of the constraints that the US has put on Ukraine in terms of defending itself to the maximum extent possible with the weapons that have been so generously provided might also apply to a NATO member state that is under attack from Russia. Because all of the things that the US advances as justifications for not allowing, for example, Ukraine to strike deep into Russia with precision-guided munitions would apply to exactly the same extent if it were Finland or Estonia that were under attack. The only difference is the piece of paper, the Article 5 guarantee. And even that, who knows, because anybody that's actually read Article 5 will know that it is at the discretion of the President of the United States just what kind of situation he's going to recognize and what action he thinks is appropriate to deal with it. So across the board, you have countries where there is no doubt that they will step up to the mark and fight, and you have others where that is open to question. And sadly, one of the most important, the most important country in NATO is now one of those where it is open to question. And in addition to that, of course, you mentioned the overall state of the British Armed Forces. This has come as a bit of a shock to those countries in Northern Europe that have traditionally looked to the UK as being the military mini superpower, one of the biggest forces within NATO outside the United States, and the people that they expected to come to their aid if something went horribly wrong. Now that, for example, our respected colleagues in Sweden have looked more closely at exactly what the state of the British Armed Forces are, they're recoiling in a certain amount of horror, because that too undermines some of the assumptions that they had made about military power in Europe. Interestingly, one of the comments that I've received from a couple of, you mentioned early on, there are a lot of people that I've spoken to for this book that could not have their names in it because of their job titles. One of the things that some of the folks working in military intelligence for various European and North American countries have said to me is that the book was actually surprisingly useful to them, because it gave the kind of survey of European military power across different countries, which they themselves didn't undertake. And particularly, of course, giving all of the links, the footnotes, the citations, the references to where this information came from. Because their task is to look at the adversary, as opposed to looking at your allies. And so when they have listened to what those allies have said about their own military power, there's been a tendency to take that on trust. And when that trust is tested against an objective investigation of what their military power really is, the findings are, it turns out, a little bit disturbing.
Thank you. Well, we are pleased to have so many people asking questions. I believe that the next person up is Sparty. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Tom.
Hello, thank you, first of all, James and John, for organizing this event, and hi again, Keir.
Can I stop you there and just I want to give thanks to Terry and to Linda, who really did a lot of the organization for this, and they did not jump up to co-host, so we did. But I just want to recognize their efforts. Sorry to interrupt you, sir.
No, sir. Terry and Linda, thank you as well, and a big cheers from all of you. Okay, so my question is about the hybrid character of the threat we are facing in Europe. What we are observing, and I'm German, and what we are observing, our intelligence community and close political allies or associates to the intelligence community, we see that they are warning us of an increasing hybrid influence activity threat, especially by the Chinese, that we have an activity ongoing that even on the European level seems to seek to partition the European Union, European countries into, let's say, small, manageable, biteable fragments that are unable to develop a joint grand strategy, oh my gosh, or a joint defense agenda for Europe. How important is it to strengthen our intelligence services to defend Europe, to defend the political level that we need to create a military defense that is viable for Europe?
There's there's one of the deep questions in terms of how you can actually change an entire mindset within Europe to recognize that the threat is real and it is present and it is coming from multiple directions. There's nothing new, of course, about the adversary, whoever it may be, seeking to break up blocks, break up supranational organizations like NATO, like the EU, like anything else, because it is far easier to pick off your targets one by one. That's been a constant, for example, in the way that Russia has dealt with NATO and the EU. And of course, now the other members of the anti-Western coalition are learning from Russia and following suit. But in order to allow the kind of mental transformation that you're talking about, in order to move on to a defense footing that is realistic and appropriate to the threat, again, you need to have a change of mindset at a political level, which then filters down through all of the government agencies that would be responsible for it. And in so many cases, we simply have not had that yet. And sadly, if the previous pattern is anything to go by, it will take a serious disaster before minds are sufficiently focused to bring about the kind of change that is required. That seems to be the only thing that actually jolts political organizations into action. As for the unity, as for the common picture and the common response, well, we're not short of international organizations that ought to be able to provide that. There are not many countries now that are not members of NATO in Europe and would have to have special arrangements made for them for that kind of shared threat picture and developing some kind of common response. You have not only NATO, you have the EU, which to some extent seeks still, even today, to duplicate some of the functions of NATO. You also have mini coalitions of the willing, like the JEF. Within all of these, it's a matter of concentric circles of trust and of shared perception of the threat. But the challenge that you've outlined, of course, is one that affects everybody. It is the weakest link in all of those individual groups that is the one that will be targeted and the one that needs to be most alert to precisely what the threat is. So getting to the root of your question, how to fix it, sadly, I think after all of this time, if we have been not able to bring about that change of approach, that change of mindset through all of these demonstrations of what the threat is and how it is metastasizing across all of the different members of this coalition, sadly, I think it will take a strategic, systemic shock for something to change.
Thank you. Indeed, if people ever see the threat, and I do sometimes wonder if people still fundamentally misunderstand Russia and who they are. And it seems to me the news does us no favors there in terms of actually illuminating the devastation and the absolute horrific methods that Russia's using. But that's not a question. That's just a comment. I want to get on to the other questions here, and I am sorry. I think it's Lexicon, then Terry, but you guys straighten that out for me, please.
I think it might be Edward next, and then Lexicon.
Oh, well.
Lexicon, go ahead. Whatever. We'll come to Edward next, and then to Terry.
Okay. Well, all the thanks apply. I'm sorry I haven't yet been able to read the book, but I certainly will. But what seems, and you've probably dealt with this, but clearly what is coping with Russian ability to wreak havoc right now is Ukraine, which is taking down, it's reached like a minimum of 1,200 troop force every day, dozens of tanks, scores some days. Taking out the from the rear or deep into Russia, the means to organize this through refineries and all this kind of thing. In fact, Lloyd Austin at the beginning had said, we want to make sure Russia cannot do this again. So that objective to defeat Russia in Ukraine really looks like now like not only the most well, it's the most effective right now, but it also looks like the most cost effective in that what one can put in terms, and especially into effective longer range deep hit air defense and air power, that those kinds of things more quickly delivered to Ukraine so that it bleeds less in doing it surely would be the way to create that longer term defense, because some people are saying that if Ukraine wins this, Russia will be set back 30 years, in fact, if it really actually wins. And the single point I'd like to draw out of that is the failure in Europe and America to see that what Ben Hodges and others see, that Crimea is essential, that the Black Sea policy that America is slowly writing, that you need to see that the Ukrainian presence and control of Crimea and of its own coastlines, both east and west of Crimea, is essential to having a viable country that will be the stalwart against these Russian moves, economic and as well as military. And I don't know if you address that in the book, but I'm just aghast or astonished at the inability to see that this would be working now, and it could be working more rapidly if Europe in particular, we don't know about the US, but whose interest it is so clearly, could see that Ukraine needs to be helped much more staunchly. And again, it's only the frontline states that seem to see it, but we need more of that physical plant available in Europe to lay on the support. I don't know if you address it in the book, but would you like to speak to that? Thank you so much.
Yes, to some extent I do talk about that. It has always been the case that the greater support provided to Ukraine, the safer Europe will be. And that support is, as you say, provided in the greatest measure by the frontline states, who are donating by proportion far more than countries like Germany, like the United States, and in some cases signing over entire sectors of military capability to Ukraine, because that military equipment will be doing the job for which it was purchased, which is wiping out those Russian armored vehicles before they actually come for you at home. Now, there are a lot of really complex issues involved, but in one way, it comes down to something now at this point, to almost 3 years into the conflict, which is extremely simple. And that is that the greater damage Ukraine, with Western assistance, can do to the Russian armed forces, the less dangerous the Russian armed forces are to their next victim. So it is a race between attriting and eroding that Russian military power and Russia reconstituting and rebuilding it as rapidly as it possibly can. Sadly, the time for setting the Russian military back 30 years, as you mentioned, yes, we did hear that kind of thing suggested. It's too late for that, because the opportunity has been missed, because the hesitancy of the United States and Germany the inability of some of the European powers, including the ones that were supposed to be serious military powers, to provide what Ukraine needed in sufficient volumes because they didn't have it themselves. The constraints that are put on them by the United States in terms of weapons use, because it's not just the US that is saying you can't strike deep into Russia, it is also putting those restraints on partner nations' weapon systems as well. All of those things have set us back in the race. And that is the reason why the Russian armed forces, the Russian army in particular, is now so much larger than the army that started the war in Ukraine. It may be less well-trained, it may be less well-equipped in some respects, but it is also better equipped in others. It's embraced technology, it's moved on to the new form of warfighting after several failed experiments that it is finding effective in clawing away land from Ukraine and inflicting a steady toll of casualties in exchange for their own much larger casualties. And all of this, of course, is teaching Russia how to fight in its next war. So we are past the stage, unfortunately, at which it could be rescued by a change of policy of the kind that you're describing. And now it is very simply a race. And it is a race which, as we discussed earlier, unfortunately, some Western European countries don't really seem to be taking an interest in joining. There has been an uptick in defense investment, finally, at long last, but not with the kind of urgency that it takes to actually get things moving at the speed of relevance. And so, once again, what it comes down to is the frontline states that understand the significance of what is happening and the importance to themselves and the way in which the processes that we see in Europe now are a threat to everybody, not just to Ukraine.
Thank you. David Bailey, you had put your hand down earlier, but I see you're available now. So please go ahead.
Well, thanks for pushing me in here. So just quickly, Keir, thanks again for being here. The question I have is really, we see the threat happening on multiple vectors across the world, and I think we're not seeing any kind of policy response to that, and so, some of that is also tied up with what you were just talking about. In general, that there isn't a policy response that's commensurate with, let's say, the realization that you say, political leaders around the world understand the threat, understand that this thing exists, but there's no action on it. What we really Sorry, am I still audible?
Yes, you are.
Still here, David.
You are now, David.
You sounded frustrated, but you're still audible.
Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. In the absence military being, let's say, the world's policeman, they're obviously uncomfortable with that role. The logical thing is that we need a global military power which has the monopoly of power worldwide to enforce international law at some point. But we're nowhere near that. So just how big is the gap between being able to get there and where we are today, from your perspective?
Yeah. Which global military power do we actually want to be enforcing the rules around the world, and whose rules? Do we want it to be the United States, or would we prefer it to be China? I think a lot of people have an answer to that question clear in their minds, but at the moment, you see the US stepping back and stepping away from some of the areas in which previously it might have been a restraining influence. And the example of Russia in prosecuting a colonialist war of aggression against Ukraine and apparently not suffering the kind of devastating consequences that other countries would have done means that bad people around the world have looked at this and have said, well, now plainly it is the time to actually launch our own wars of aggression, our own score settling, our own genocide, whatever it may happen to be. Because the two areas of priority that have been consistent for the United States are China and Israel. And everything else seems to be sliding because it is a secondary priority, including, sadly, Europe. And if this comes through, it must be incredibly galling if you are sitting in Ukraine are looking at the lengths to which the United States will go to protect Israel, all of which have been denied for a European state, and the way in which some of the measures that have been taken against Israel's aggressors further highlight the difference between a problem that the United States takes seriously and one to which it is only paying lip service. And the example that really was striking for me was the way in which drone strikes by Iranian drones on Israel, not the most recent wave, but back in April, led to US sanctions on Iranian drone manufacturers, regardless of the fact that those same drone manufacturers had been supplying them to Russia, and they had been used against cities and residential areas and the usual most vulnerable possible targets in Ukraine for getting on for a year then. So the only possible logical conclusion from that action, sanctioning it for Israel and not for Ukraine, is that the United States is fairly relaxed about Iranian drones killing people as long as they're Ukrainian and not Israeli.
Want to come back on that, David?
Yeah, so I mean, indeed. So Europe needs to step up, and possibly other countries around the world. I mean, the logical thing that I kind of look to is basically the from the terms of international law, let's say, the problem that we have is criminality. So if we look at so many of the problems that are used in political debate around the world, including the United States elections right now, but also things like Brexit, migration, a key one, freedom of navigation and rule of on the rule of law on the seas would be a sensible place to start, right? In terms of putting together some kind of coalition to start clamping down on the Houthis firing missiles at tankers in the Red Sea and so on and so forth. But there don't seem to be moves in the international sphere to go in that direction. And I'm, you hinted at it earlier. What's it going to take to make that jolt, to make people realise that that's what we need to do? It has to be some kind of atrocity. Hopefully, that's not the case. But how do you see that? Are there discussions that you're aware of between, let's say, NATO and other armed forces around the world that indicate that we're moving in that direction or not? And if so, what are they? We get whispers that there's going to be a NATO office in Tokyo, for example. Things like this pop out every now and then, but there doesn't seem to be a realization on the policy level that those are the steps that need to happen. And certainly, from the population's point of view, let's say in Western Europe, in Germany in particular, there's not a readiness, I guess, amongst the general populations of Western democratic nations to support something like that. Maybe in Japan it's slightly different, and maybe Japan would be much more open to support that kind of policing of the seas. But I don't see that discussion going on at all, and that's a concern.
Well, there is an international coalition that is protecting shipping in the Red Sea, and that too was another ample demonstration of how protection is offered to some people, but not to Ukraine. Because think about the analogous situation that you had in the Black Sea when Russia was blocking it to, again, international trade, and Ukraine was left to its own devices. Now, it's not a directly comparable situation, of course, because the amount of naval support that you can give in the Black Sea is limited by the Commission Montreux, etc., etc. However, it was another plain demonstration that the words and the actions are saved for issues about which the United States and the international community cared. And in this case, sea transit, sea lines of communication through the Red Sea was something that prompted it to action. Black Sea, not at all. But the other point of your question was, well, what about international law? Again, I fear it is too late. International law is dead. Who is going to enforce it? Is it the United Nations, whose Secretary General was seen bowing to a convicted war criminal? A wanted war criminal just a few days ago. Picture how you feel if you are in the International Criminal Court and your job is actually to uphold international law in that area, and you see your work being mocked by somebody who is supposed to be the embodiment of this unity of nations to uphold an international order. We are past the stage now at which international law needs to be maintained. Like deterrence, it now needs to be re-established, and that is going to be inevitably a messy, dangerous, and extremely expensive process.
So basically, I think you're saying that you'd foresee some kind of strategic defeat or jolt, like a catastrophe on kind of a 9/11 scale, forcing some kind of coalescence of a bloc around NATO-ish, let's say. I mean, sorry to be vague and not very precise in language, but NATO-ish to do the enforcement job, because otherwise...
Well, when we first started this... Yeah, when we first started talking, it was we were warned against the dangers of reckless optimism. I think it's too late even for that. I think you mentioned atrocities as something which might prompt action. We've had so many atrocities, and it has done nothing. What is it that NATO, without the United States, would actually be able to do to try to reestablish the rules-based international order that it took for granted until it slipped away because it was not cared for, because there was not the resolve to confront the malign actors that were challenging it and undermining it and seeking to work around it? And so it has gone. We are past that stage, and you can count that very easily by looking at the number of conflicts that have proliferated around the globe, starting or expanding as a result of this vacuum of attention from those powers that might previously have been interested in maintaining stability and maintaining that rules-based international order. So, once again, I do not see the way back to a situation that people liked to call peace before 2022, because we are just too far gone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, David, for the questions. Terry Fella, welcome.
Hi, James and John, and welcome, Keir. Good to hear you again, and thank you so much for your time. I know we've just gone over the hour already, so I hope you've got another few hours spare. Because there's a lot of questions, and you do realise you'll have to come back again. A few of the questions have already been answered. I've got so many of them, and certainly one of the bits that you brought up just now about the UN is basically now useless, particularly after the recent behaviour of Antonio Guterres. But one of my big things is about the fact that, and you mentioned as well, everything is all right so long as it's only Ukrainians being killed. And one of my big concerns is the fact that we do seem to be, or the powers that be, seem to be just waiting and drawing it all out and allowing Ukraine to bleed while giving themselves time to build up supplies, which I don't think is they're not acting quickly enough. So one of my big questions is, are they beginning to listen to the likes of you and other think tanks more seriously? Are you seeing signs that we know the eastern countries bordering Russia are paying more attention, but the other ones, and we know that the USA is a big struggle, but are they beginning to take on board what's really happening? And another small question I have, well, it's a big question in a way, the fact that the USA is not allowing the equipment and the military stuff that is provided by the EU to Ukraine, is that not going to damage the military complex industry within the USA? Is that not going to start saying to the more European countries, right, we'll have to start building for ourselves? So aren't they sort of shooting themselves in the foot by not giving permission to strike deep into Russia? Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Yes, looking forward to seeing you at one of the book launches in not very long from now in London. There's quite a lot to unpack there. Let me start with the last question there, the damage to U.S. arms exports as a result of the United States demonstrating that it might put limitations on how they can be used. It's not as bad for the US as it is, for example, Switzerland, who has taken the similar policy and has found it's bitten them in the tender parts because nobody's buying Swiss because they see what limitations will actually be put on them. The United States is in a much more powerful position because there are so many aspects of high-end military technology where there is no real alternative to buying American. And that's one of the challenges that we've seen across Europe. The attempts to restart European defense industries in some cases have found that there isn't really a defense industry to restart. There's a good reason why, for example, F-35s are set to be the dominant combat aircraft across much of the continent in not very many years from now. So there isn't really an alternative to buying American, but yes, you do see some countries recognizing that actually this presents a vulnerability because who knows what stipulations might actually be put in the future on the use of the weapons that have been supplied by the United States by another country that's under attack from Russia. And this, of course, goes to this crisis of confidence that we have in U.S. commitments to its NATO treaty obligations and how exactly those commitments might be circumscribed. So yes, it is a huge problem. And it's one which the extent of which will only become clear when it's actually tested. And that, of course, is we're already in the worst case scenario if you get to a stage where we are trying to work out whether the United States will meet its commitments, but nobody's really putting in the amount of effort and investment and preparation that would be necessary to avoid that situation in the first place, which comes to the first part of your question there. Is there the recognition that the threat is there, the threat is real, and it's coming very shortly? Yes, there is. We don't have to have those conversations anymore. It is commonly accepted among the European governments that we habitually talk to and major parts of the United States as well, with that huge, sprawling, disparate administration and government, which has wildly differing views on some international issues, depending which bit of it you talk to. But yes, some parts the message is very clear that the threat from Russia is coming soon and needs to be withstood. The problem is not that. It's something we discussed a little bit earlier. The problem is not the understanding that the threat is very real and is approaching. It's actually getting people to do something about it. And that's where that failure of imagination, failure of logic, leading to people actually taking action in government and adjusting the assumptions that have driven their spending priorities for the last 3 decades to recognize that it is actually something a little bit more important to spend on, namely the survival of your country.
Thank you, Keir. Can I just add to that as well? So how important do you feel it is, particularly in the US, about the influence of the likes of Sullivan and Sharap?
I am hesitant to join the chorus of everybody blaming Jake Sullivan for what is going on, because I simply don't have the degree of insight into that internal decision-making process. And sadly, I think in some cases, the people that pontificate very positively about how this works are a little bit like some of the old school criminologists, in that they are stating with supreme confidence something that they absolutely have no way of knowing. Now, the overall complex, the overall result of whatever has been going on in the National Security Council and in the White House is plain to see, and it is disastrous, and it has been disastrous for some time. But the exact mechanism, the route by which we got there, I suspect is not quite as simplistic as is sometimes portrayed. And then we got an indication of that when, in the middle of last year, I and a few other Chatham House colleagues that look at the Russia problem or looking at the Russia-Ukraine war took to DC, something that we had written in. It was called How to End the War on Ukraine. It should have been called How Not to End the War on Ukraine, because it was all about the possible outcomes for the conflict that were being kicked about at that time, including ceasefire, negotiated settlement, the usual suspects, and how disastrous they would be. But as part of that, we spoke to as many different elements of the US administration and government that were relevant as we could get introductions to. And what came through very, very clearly from those conversations was how there was no common picture across them. that there were very different appreciations of the nature of the problem, where it was going, what the risks were involved in confronting Russia, and that really gave an insight into what sometimes looks like policy incoherence from the United States. Now, we had a lot of conversations about the risk of escalation because then, even more than now, that was the dominant conversation. Why was it that the United States was so fearful about allowing Ukraine to inflict damage on Russia? And once we had worked through some of the rationales that had been publicly stated by the United States for avoiding escalation as opposed to trying to manage escalation, and successively demolished some of the arguments that are put forward, some of which have become even more ridiculous since then. What people fell back on repeatedly in office after office that we visited was, well, that's all very well, but this is what the president has decided, so this is what we have to do. So at some level, it does go back to the White House. It goes back to a decision that has been taken a long time ago, possibly under the influence of these long-standing Russian campaigns of reflexive control, that you cannot inflict too much damage on Russia because it is more dangerous to defeat Russia than to bleed Russia slowly in the manner the United States is doing now, with the tragic side effect, of course, that it bleeds Ukraine slowly as well.
Thank you, Keir. Thank you.
Let's move right on. Shaggy, you to put your hand down.
Hi.
Let's back up. Are you
James,
in the right
James.
order, John? Go ahead.
James, can I just jump in here?
Oh,
Just
I'm
a couple of housekeeping things. This is such a great discussion. I wish there were more people here listening to it. So please retweet the space if you would be so kind. Maybe get some more people in here who would get a lot out of this discussion. Secondly, we've got a full speaker panel at the moment, and I know that we've got a queue of people waiting. So if you've asked your question and you're done, if you could drop down, that would be great. And then next, I think we've got Edward, and then Shaggy, who's back up after dropping down with his hand up, and then we go to Bruce, and then we go to Martin. Edward, sorry to keep you waiting. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, Keir, thank you so much for coming. I'm a big fan of yours. But in fact, what you've just been speaking about was more or less the question I had. But I just did want to reflect. You know, my concern has been the sort of almost complete absence of democratic scrutiny of the U.S. policy in respect of, you know, the slow rolling of military support and the restrictions placed on Ukraine. All we get is sort of John Kirby, sort of like, yeah, well, this is it, this is that. I mean, we never really drill down into the reasons. You've mentioned that you've encountered diversities of view. I don't even know if it's possible to have. I mean, is there a science of escalation management that you can sort of apply unilaterally from the Oval Office, or are there negotiations in back channels between the US and Russia? Is that why we're not allowed to know or discuss what's going on? To me, it just seems completely baffling. Or perhaps it's just about US domestic politics, keeping an isolationist opponent from scoring points with your foreign entanglements. Maybe they don't want to see Russia collapse, but the whole situation I've just found completely baffling, and the lack of democratic scrutiny. You know, if it was the UK government in charge of the largest military in the world, every question time we'd have people, you know, trying to nail him or her on these issues. Very strange to me.
Yes, it's something of the tragedy of U.S. politics at the moment, that the form of democratic scrutiny that this takes is people shouting at the administration to support Ukraine less, not support it more. But then that, of course, is a side effect of the United States' ongoing political nervous breakdown, which not many of us can do very much about, except hopefully our American friends and colleagues by voting next week. As for the way in which all of these different justifications that you've put forward, these possible rationales for U.S. policy have been floating around, they're all plausible to some extent. And it has been suggested that one of the things that might explain so many of the U.S. statements and actions that are otherwise inexplicable was, in fact, some kind of backdoor deal between the US and Russia before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine to limit the conflict to Ukraine. And yes, you can have Ukraine as long as you don't expand further, and in response, we will not support Ukraine fully. Now, that's a suggestion which has been made repeatedly, but not very loudly, and has been soundly rubbished by people both within the U.S. administration and people who ought to know about it. But it still remains that nagging fact that it is the most complete conspiracy theory explanation for everything that's been going on. The trouble is, no matter which thread you pull at in terms of trying to figure out what's going on, it always ends up with a disreputable conclusion. And as we've been discussing for so long, the consequences now are so embedded that it's a question of re-establishing everything that we took for granted in terms of maintaining peace, rather than trying to keep us at peace now. And that also applies to deterrence. Deterrence needs to be re-established rather than maintained, because Russia is plainly not deterred at the moment from escalating its campaigns, both globally and against Europe in the covert space. In terms of whether there's a manual, well, we did write a manual back in September of 2021. We published a Chatham House paper called "What Deters Russia," which was all about what deters Russia. In other words, historical case studies from what has and has not been effective in dissuading Russia from doing something stupid and dangerous, like, for example, invading a neighboring country. And it came up with a number of different findings that have been consistently the case over years, decades, and some recommendations for how to apply them in the future. Now, sadly, none of those were actually applied in January, February 2022, and here we are. But that report is still available on the Chatham House website, and maybe actually our hosts have a link there. They could pop up there somewhere.
Let me see if I can find it. Excellent. So, Shaggy, go ahead.
I think I've got it.
Yeah, thanks very much. Hi, Keir. I haven't read your book yet, but I'm going to get to read it. So earlier you mentioned some kind of strategic events or events that may be required to shake a US-led NATO out of boiling the frog with Ukrainian blood, as I term it. What kind of strategic level events are you thinking? The only two that I can think of are Pearl Harbor type events, or a bunch of assassinations, basically what happened in World War One. I wonder if there are any other type of strategic level events you can think of which would shake Ukraine's, in quotes, allies out of their stupor.
Well, sadly, the most obvious candidate is, in fact, precisely the kind of overt military intervention that the book focuses on. The fact that if Russia does make a military move which exposes not only the reluctance of the United States to meet its NATO commitments, but also the hollowness of the armed forces of European states and their incapacity to defend themselves after they've taken so little interest in doing so over the last few decades, then that you might expect would shake up things a little and focus people's minds on what is required in order to actually keep countries, societies, people safe in the future. The obvious downside, of course, is that at that point it is too late. But I don't see another path at the moment, after everything that has been said and done and argued and shouted from the rooftops over the last not just 3 years, but the last decade, about the requirement to withstand Russia, and it's had close to zero impact. I don't see anything short of something disastrous actually making a difference.
Thanks very much.
Okay, so next up, I think it's Roos. Go ahead, Roos.
Well, you just basically answered my question, but maybe we can elaborate a bit on it. Well, I agree. Somehow, the moral and logical failure with everything's been done, the lack of hope and all this escalation management, whatever kind it is. One of the few things that would explain it is that neither the European nor the American military is ready. But how far from ready is the US in that case? I know some of the European countries are at least building their militaries up, and maybe in the 2030s sometimes they might be ready again. But how far is the US?
Well, of course, the the US is very accustomed to being the core of NATO, the backbone of NATO, the enabler for everything else that happens within NATO, and of course the military power in Europe that all of the frontline states want to have on their side. But the problem that we're facing now is not just the challenge of escalation being a dirty word within the United States, but also the very real resource challenges and the fact that the U.S. attention and energy is being pulled in so many different directions, some of which, as we've discussed earlier, are just more important than what's happening in Europe. Now, let's be absolutely clear about the fact that this is not the US's fault that European powers have been so reluctant to actually look after themselves, but they are now left holding the baby because they have been sheltering under the US security blanket so comfortably for so long that it is going to take, as you mentioned, years, decades to actually get themselves back in a position where they can look after themselves. And that, of course, is where we have this race against time element coming in as well, because all of the predictions of when Russia will be ready, willing, and able to actually make its move are so much sooner than when European powers are going to be in its position to withstand them. And this, unfortunately, is the likelihood of the continuation of the pattern of some countries that are willing to defend democracy starting wars disastrously at a tragic cost in the lives of good young men and women. Now, esteemed hosts, I can be around for about another 15 to 16 minutes at this point, so maybe some quick fire question and answers if that's possible.
Very good. Let's do quick questions here, folks. And I believe, Martin, that you are next.
Yes, hello. Do you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Martin, we hear you.
Okay, perfect. I want just a little bit follow-up question. The name Samuel Jarrett has already fallen, so I will dive into that a bit. So there is a considerable strain of scientists and academia arguing that we should give in to Russia's aggression in the way that we should placate them in Ukraine. But they go even a step further, that they actually are deterred by Russian nuclear threats, and also argue that the use of Russia's nuclear threat is very real. And they even say that they don't believe that the US will be willing to defend the Eastern European countries if it comes to a war. And in the same way, they are arguing that arming Europe again would be an aggression, or would be perceived by Russia as a threat. And even though they are not very, even though you don't see them very often, or they're not very overpresent in academic discourse, I think they have a considerable influence on policy decisions. So what's your opinion on that?
Well, I agree. This is absolutely correct. Yes, you do have people who argue all of these things, which for whatever reason are often completely indistinguishable from what Russia would like our decision makers to hear. But sadly, that does not necessarily mean that they're being incentivized to do so by Russia. They can arrive sometimes at these bizarre conclusions through their own investigations and their own understanding of the situation, helped along, of course, by these long-standing, decades-long campaigns of Russian dis and misinformation and reflexive control. The net effect, of course, is the same, whether we are dealing with useful idiots unconsciously forwarding Russia's messages, or agents of influence who are in fact directly taking instructions from Moscow and delivering the most harmful information directly into the ears of decision makers behind closed doors. Because let's not forget that while a lot of this plays out in the public space, it is what happens in those private conversations that is far more damaging, excuse me, because one word in the ear of a decision maker at the wrong moment can be worth tens of thousands of people repeating something on Twitter. But we must emphasize that the fact that somebody appears to be delivering Russia's messages did not necessarily mean that they are working for Moscow. That determining that difference is a counterintelligence challenge, and that, of course, is tricky for a lot of countries, particularly European ones, because it takes investment of resources, it takes investment of political capital in taking an interest in whether people, sometimes quite senior, well-connected, prominent people, are actually working for a hostile power, even if it's actually illegal to do that. So it is a more complicated issue, again, than the sometimes black and white picture that you get shown from people who look at what some of our prominent academics and think tankers say and draw the obvious conclusion, but it's not actually necessarily the right conclusion. We do need to know, though, which is right and which is wrong.
May I just follow up with one quick question, because it's just discussed it with a colleague. The use of Russian nuclear threat is, in my opinion, somehow an offensive use of nuclear weapons, because they invade a country and then they threat people with using their nukes. Why isn't that discussed anymore? That it's actually an offensive use of those weapons, even though they are not used by themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Russia has used nuclear weapons, but as an information weapon rather than for their primary purpose. And with time being so tight, I think, Martin, we may have spoken about this before, but I'm going to refer you to another. Here's one we wrote earlier, because back in March of last year, we published a study on Russian nuclear intimidation and how effective it has been in shaping Western policy, particularly US and German policy. And last about 2 or 3 weeks ago, we had cause to present that again. We reviewed all of the findings in that and found that they were still very much on target, including describing the future direction of how that was going to develop. So maybe the host could pop the link for that in somewhere visible as well. And that's available, again, for everybody to download from the Chatham House website.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Keir. Okay, so mindful of Keir's time, Linda, I think, and then Lexicon, and then Cox off for 6.
Yeah, thanks. I think my questions would require a longer answer than what we have. So let me pass and go to the next person. And in the meantime, I'm going to post that intimidation article here shortly.
Got it.
Oh, you have it already?
It'll be in the nest in a second.
Okay, all right.
Excellent. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Linda. Lexicon.
Yeah, so on this nuclear deterrence idea, well, sort of. So Bob Woodward's new book, we saw a lot of the part of the interview in which Lloyd Austin tells Shoigu that, don't do it, and the thing about I'm not accustomed to issuing threats. But what I saw only in one interview was an additional part where he says, we are at present limiting our actions, limiting what we give to the Ukrainians and how and where we allow them to use this. Were you to go about using any sort of nuclear weapon, all such restraints would be off. I mean, literally, that as long as a guarantee, as long as you don't use a nuke on Ukraine, we won't take off these limits. And we had talked about that was a wild theory. Some kind of guarantee has been issued. Months ago, there was talk of that, and we dismissed it as ridiculous. And now we see Woodward quoting the verbatim, as he calls it, of that conversation. So if to me, that kind of it makes me understand the way Joe Biden has been absolutely categorical. And so the old man is very stubborn, and this is the way he thinks. But to me, I mean, I just hope that that Harris, whom I expect to see there, will not have swallowed that kind of stuff. I wondered if you had seen that and understood it as seen that kind of guaranteeing form of behavior on the part of the U.S. thing.
Well, we've also seen a more effective way of using a similar kind of leverage. We have seen the way in which other countries than the United States are willing to make good on their promises and to link the provision of weapon systems to Ukraine that may or may not have been going to happen anyway with specific items of Russian behavior, such as, for example, Storm Shadow, that has been so effective in strikes into Crimea in particular, being delivered to Ukraine as a consequence for Russia not ceasing its attacks on civilian targets and civilian infrastructure. So it is possible to use leverage as opposed to simply frittering it away in the way that we've seen so often happen from so many coalition partners in the past. These really... the part that I think was a little more problematic even more problematic in the Bob Woodward book was this quoting of a US assessment that in October 2022, there was a 50% chance of Russia using a tactical nuclear weapon. And that's been widely repeated as being something that was actually the case, which, of course, is very helpful for Russia because it reinforces this impression that they were on a nuclear hair trigger, which unfortunately elides the difference between a book by Bob Woodward, which we shouldn't always necessarily take as gospel, saying that the United States intelligence agencies had arrived at an assessment that there was a 50% chance that Russia might do something stupid, as opposed to the actual real Russian attitude being on a coin toss. There's a very big difference between the two, and that has been missed, I think, in a lot of the reporting of this.
I am going to jump in here and ask a question, and that is, what is the danger to the United States of the current situation in Europe? Because I think we've been talking about the danger to Europe very much, but is there a message to the United States that they should be hearing?
Yeah, absolutely. The United States is far less in danger of direct military attack than Europe is for obvious reasons, but it is not less in danger of the second and third order effects and the economic repercussions and the way in which the kind of catastrophic disorder that we're thinking about in Europe would have ramifications for security and prosperity of Americans at home. Because for all of the trading links with Asia, it is still the European Union that is far and away the greater tie for the US economy and the greater underpinning of US prosperity based on global trade. If that disappears, it's going to hurt the United States and it'll hurt it badly. And we should remember that the reason why the United States not only supported European security, but also tied itself into so many global international organizations was not out of pure altruism. It wasn't just a mission to save the world and be the global policeman. It was also as a result of the recognition that this was important actually for the US itself, for the US economy, for the US trade, for dealing with security threats before they actually reach the United States itself. That recognition seems to have slipped away, at least on one side of this political divide that we see playing out in this election. And that is a highly dangerous situation, first in line for the countries that the United States is going to be less interested in defending, but then not very long afterwards for the United States itself as it loses that global leadership role that was so important to its position and its prosperity.
Thank you for that. How are we doing on time?
I should probably be away in about 4 minutes and 30 seconds.
Okay, very good. Let's do it then. And Terry, I don't know if you're next. You tell us.
Yeah, I don't mind waiting. Let Ruth go first.
Okay, this is more a comment than a question, and it's short. When it comes to nuclear weapons, we can't forget that Scholz and Biden, they also have to take in consideration, would they themselves authorize their own militaries to strike back in any way? If the Russia fired a nuke, would they then risk escalating the situation further? And I'm not sure about the answer on that question, and that could explain a lot of their actions.
Thank you, Bruce.
Yeah, absolutely. But one of the things that is really striking when you consider the accusation that is sometimes made against us, and it's a fair one, that it's fine for us to pontificate about use of nuclear weapons and daring Russia to do it because we wouldn't deal with the consequences of if that actually happened. Whereas the decision makers in the US in particular do carry that can. But then you look at the attitude to this question of the people in Ukraine and in the frontline states. In other words, the people who, if something did go catastrophically wrong and there were use of nuclear weapons, would be the ones who would bear the brunt of the consequences. And they are the ones who are most bullish, who are least intimidated, who are most confident that actually, no, you should face down Russia and run this risk, as opposed to the United States, which would be so far away as to be invulnerable, short of an actual global nuclear war, which is the least likely scenario and something that's not even under discussion here. So look at the people who have the most at stake and see how their attitude is to risk, and I think it's very telling. I should probably bail out in about 2 minutes. So should we wrap up, esteemed hosts? And with apologies to the folks that didn't get to ask a question, I'm easy to find.
Well, first, thank you so much for your time and your expertise and these important messages about our preparedness or lack thereof, and just what we need to do. And essentially, I think the willingness or unwillingness of individuals to support their own countries in their defense is a critical issue that I think we'll need to address and really ramp up and make sure that people feel like they're getting something from their government. Otherwise, they will not feel like defending it. And at some point, we'll have to deal with oligarchs, because much of the money that people wrestle over, is it healthcare or defense? What should we spend on? If oligarchs would pay their taxes, we would not have to have debates like that. So I think we have many things to wrestle with here. And I thank you so much for coming, and I hope that you can come back again. It would be really good, because you probably get the idea here that we could probably ask you endless questions. And I think that is the case, because John and I probably have more. So, but we understand your time is valuable, and you probably have other obligations. So congratulations on the book. Thank you so much for that. It was a real pleasure, a little bit alarming pleasure, but a real pleasure to read. You did fine speaking it as well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure. And yes, if I don't leave people alarmed, I plainly haven't been doing my job properly. So yes, I must dash to the next commitment. And thank you very much, everybody. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you so much, Keir. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, Keir.
By Keir Giles. Definitely go out and buy it. It is a tremendous read, and definitely a book that should be on your bookshelf, and recommend it to everybody too. So thank you so much, Keir.
And give Keir a follow too.
Join us and Volya Radio.